Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Well over a week ago, the French President Emmanuel Macron and German Chancellor Angela Merkel joined forces in proposing a €500 billion EU recovery fund to help respond to the coronavirus crisis. Building on that, on Wednesday of this week, the European Commission announced a €750 billion recovery package that would assist the European Union, which has been heavily impacted by the coronavirus, get back on its feet. The proposal, of course, needs the approval of all EU nations, and if approved, it would represent a historic step in the merging of the finances of the bloc's 27 members. As such, it would be an important step forward for a more unified Europe, and it might bring the bloc closer together rather than fracturing it. But the proposal is not without controversy. The so-called Frugal Four, the Netherlands, Denmark, Austria, and Sweden, have already raised doubts about the plan. Joining us today from Hamburg after a long week in Berlin and on the cusp of an extended weekend to talk about whether or not this is a historic moment for Europe is Bundestag member Metin Hakverdi. Metin, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Steve. Thank you. Yeah, good to be with you.
So Metin Hakverdi is particularly well suited to speak with us today because he serves on the Bundestag's Committee on European Union Affairs and also on both the Budget and the Finance Committees in the German Bundestag. So Metin, faced with the devastating economic challenges posed by the corona crisis, the government of Chancellor Angela Merkel broke with decades of German economic and fiscal policy by agreeing to back the idea of a collective European debt to help support those countries that have been hardest hit by the pandemic. Some pundits have described the Franco-German proposal as a, quote, Hamiltonian moment for Europe because of the potential that this EU recovery package has to serve as a major step forward toward greater European unity. What's your take on this?
Well, thank you. I just went through my door 3 minutes ago, so it's good to be back from Berlin on my couch in my living room. So forgive me if I'm not really sorted out at this point, Steve. Thank you for having me. This is a super important time for us for several reasons. For us is Germany, but also the European Union, the continent, Europe as a whole, which is even more than the European Union. Not only because of the crisis we face right now, the corona crisis, but also we've having, I would say, a series of crises in the 21st century, which led either to the end of all civilization in Europe and populism will win at the end and right-wing populists will take over. Or on the other hand, and actually there's a good chance that this will happen, not only because I'm always the guy where the glass is half full, but we have managed the financial crisis, as you remember, to manage it in some sort of way also. So the history of the European Union is to grow, to get better, to fix, I would say, fundamental structural problems of the European Union during crises. And this is a Hamiltonian moment. So what was I went to Simi Valley High School in 1986, and I took also American history, but I had to look up what the Compromise of 1719 was. So I don't know whether all of you guys are aware of this, but I found it interesting to see that I would say it is probably one of the most important points in the history of the United States. But at the time the compromise was made, it was basically a bargain between parties like always. People that had more money than others. Some wanted the capital of the United States at a different point where it was. And it was a compromise on, I would say, small things, if you compare it to the big thing that happened out of it, making the United States a fiscal sovereign player, which was the prerequisite, remember this, for the 100 years to come, for the Louisiana Purchase, to fight any war the United States fought after this moment. So it is one of the super Hamiltonian moment, I would say, is a moment of great decision making, but probably not everybody's aware of the fact that while this decision is made, it is such a big thing. So having said this, we are in a super important moment at this point. Because of the crisis, obviously, some guys that have been around for the last 10 or 12 years after the financial crisis that would not be willing to go one step further in what in German is meant Staatlichkeit. I have no idea how to translate that into English because obviously Germany has a different approach to Staatlichkeit as the United States. But to give the European Union some sense of Staatlichkeit without having this central super state, usually nobody wants in the European Union. And it has always been around this fiscal moment, the matter of taxes, the matter of spending, and the matter of some sort of unity on state affairs. And this moment is now been reached, not generally and not for the end of time. Conservatives are still around also in Europe, but definitely for this moment of the Corona crisis. And this is the first time. This is actually the first time. The European Union will be able, if this goes through, to borrow money on the financial market for itself, for the European Union, and pay it back as a European Union. And that's a totally new deal. Because obviously, once you have this instrument, there are questions, first of all, on what criteria do you get the money? So what is the interest rate if you and I would buy in European Union bonds? Second question is, who is spending it for what? And the third question in democracies is, how are those guys who are deciding to spend it be controlled, I would say, in a democratic way? Because then it's connected to elections in the European Union. And that's a total different ballgame and a new kind of Staatlichkeit. And I'm a social democrat, so just two more sentences on this one. You said the Macron-Merkel deal. Okay, we give this to Mrs. Merkel. We are glad she did it for two reasons. One, she will run again. And the second is, it was also a prerequisite for this super big step is you had to have a social democratic finance minister and a conservative chancellor at the same time. Otherwise, it would not have worked. Actually, the technique, all the criteria, all the dealing with France and between the financial systems, all of this was done by Olaf Scholz. It was his idea as it developed. But Mrs. Merkel basically made the, I would say, fiscal conservative side in her own party, basically make them to follow on this one. And it was the idea of conservatism in Germany till 2 weeks ago that they will never ever do this, what is now proposed. So this is the really new thing, not only for Europe, but also in Germany happening at this time. So this maybe as a start.
Well, Metin, it's a great start. And of course, you're right on calling me out on having called it a Merkel-Macron deal. No, but I would of course have asked you about the role that Olaf Scholz had to play in all of this, because as you just touched on, it's unimaginable that under his predecessor, Wolfgang Schäuble, this kind of a deal could have come about. Granted, the circumstances of where we are right now is very different from anything that we've seen before. And I think you raised the issue of the fact that already in this century, we've experienced a number of important crises that have shaken Europe, whether it's the financial crisis or the refugee crisis or now the coronavirus crisis. Each of those other crises has tested Europe in different ways and has tested the sovereignty of nation states, but also the willingness to give up sovereignty to Brussels. And I guess there are two very different questions I'd like to ask you. The first one is, can you unpack a little bit more the thinking of the finance minister and vice chancellor Olaf Scholz in making this happen now? But the other question, and I think it ties into this too, is this proposal signifies a huge leap of faith. It signifies vesting authority in Brussels in a way that has been unprecedented up to now. Why do you think that Europe is ready to make this move, or at least parts of Europe? are ready to make this move right now?
Well, just to throw in the most difficult issue of this task now is, and you might be surprised because we have been talking about who is paying whom in this system of sovereign member states on the one hand and the European Union on the other hand. Are you still listening? Can you hear me while you're gone? No, okay, but I will continue on this one. My belief is the super important question of this, to measure, not to measure just success, but to be successful generally, is the question how this money will be spent. That sounds a little crazy because we have been fighting for over a decade now on the system of getting taxes, of paying and to finance the European Union. But now, because it's so much money in a rather short time to spend, the question comes up, what are we doing with this money? So once 500 billion euros are on the table, and for credit lines, another 250 billion, let's say that would happen this way, and I'm pretty confident it will happen this way. What are we paying with this money? Mm-hmm. And this is a super important question for two reasons. One is economically, is it worth spending the money? So are you spending it for the right causes? But also, what does it do to this new Staatlichkeit of the European Union in the long run? So this is what we have to watch, and who's deciding on it. And you know what? By all the decision making that has been made in the last 2 weeks is probably, in spite of the 4 member states you mentioned before, I'm positive. I think it will happen. They will be bought out of this decision. That's a usual European Union way to do it, and they will agree on that one, I believe. But the question, who's deciding to spend the money for, that is not 100% clear how to organize this. So there's some agreement on to put it into the budget, the main frame budget of the European Union in the next 7 years. Others have other ideas, and what the role of the member states and the governments of the member states to agree on that spending is not 100% clear at this point. So there's more to decide. So it's not over with this one proposal by the Commission.
So Metin, you sound fairly confident that this band of 4, the frugal 4, the Netherlands, Austria, Sweden, and Denmark, will come on board ultimately with this. I think the big question, though, is whether this group would or could ultimately torpedo a plan that has broad support, and what sort of economic and political damage that could bring with it for those countries, but also for Europe as a whole.
Well, that is something that is really difficult to understand for Americans. We have a system in the European Union where at the end of all compromise, one country of the size of Luxembourg, so find me a US state the size of Luxembourg, what is that? I have no idea. A small state can basically veto everything of fundamental economic and political and also foreign policy interests of the European Union. So that's crazy. But that's Europe. Because of this, we were able to go this far since the mid-50s with this project of the European Union. Because you know the past of we didn't have a Hamiltonian moment in the 18th century. You know what we had in the 18th century. You know the history of the continent. So this is the home. If you criticize national tendencies of nationalism worldwide today, well, guess what is the home of nationalism, and who have brought it to the darkest hours of the history of mankind was in Europe. So this is actually not a weakness of our system. It's the strength to bring all those interests together. If it wasn't for this moment, if it wasn't for this consensus idea, imagine what the role of Germany and France would be. So we are forced, the government of Germany and every single member of the German parliament, like I am, but also my friends from France, we are forced with any decision to think of the smallest member country at the same time. We are forced to do so, always, with every super small step and the real big steps. Whether it's the ESM, whether it's the treaties. If you want to touch the treaties, you can talk about this. If you talk about majority making decisions by simple majorities in the foreign policy or the economic reasoning, you always have to put yourself automatically in the shoes of the smallest state. And that is breathtaking. It takes a long time. It is not fun always. But two things: you learn a lot about Europe, you learn a lot about member states, but you also, looking back the last decades, this is actually the tool that made it possible, that ended all this, which made it possible since World War II that we are still in this phase of great economic stability and peace on the continent, which is a total exception in the history of our continent, as you know.
So, Metin, before we start taking questions from our viewers, let me ask you your assessment of the timing a little bit. Of course, European leaders are slated to meet on June 19th, and it's open as to whether this will be a virtual meeting or an in-person meeting. But both Berlin and Paris have dampened the hope that the next European Council could see a deal. They've said that European leaders should find a compromise in the fall to give national parliaments and the European Parliament, quote, enough time to discuss and ratify the proposal mechanisms so that they can enter into force on January 1st. Is that realistic, or do you think that there would be I mean, there are obviously reasons for fast tracking this, but do you think that it will really wait until January 1st for this to come into effect?
I don't know, but I can tell you, if you look at from the perspective of Spain and Italy, and because of those two countries are always mentioned in this context, we don't know what the future brings. It could be any other country in the future. It could be Italy had a surplus in their budget for the last 23 years, but they had this big mountain of debt from before. So I don't want to be always taking those two examples, but just to make my point, if those two countries would, let's say, next week have a super severe problem on the international bond market to get to refinance their budget, I'm sure the European Union, the monetary zone, would react super fast. So it is always a question, what is at stake on how fast you get decided. You know what, this is a little ironic. I know nobody should be ironic in politics, just to make my point. I hope we will be having a decision only in January, because that would mean the crisis is not that severe in the second half of this year. If the crisis gets economically super severe, I'm very sure the consensus would be made earlier. Everybody knows this is super serious. What we are doing now, we are spending a lot of money. This is an awkward idea probably for Americans. We're spending a ton of money to get all this, basically to stop the economic engine, but at the same time spending the money for everybody who's making money out of this engine. So Kurzarbeitergeld and whatsoever. So you cannot do this forever. So at a certain point, the idea that is a perfect idea to go through short-term crisis becomes a real problem, makes the problem even bigger if the crisis is too long. So I hope we are dealing it out like we always do in the European Union, and it will be a little crazy from the outside. But I hope the economic crisis is not going to be that big in the second half of the year. If we land at something around 7 or 8% in recession over the year, that is awful. Don't misunderstand me. That is for the lowest 20, 30 income in Europe, it will be super devastating, but it is not the end of time. It is manageable. If you look at the numbers of the recession followed by the financial crisis 12 years ago, 11 years ago, we were able to get out of this super fast, super fast. As I read papers of analytics today is it will, by the structure of the crisis, not be as easy as it was to get out that fast. It will not go this V-shaped rocket taking off economy afterwards this time. It will take a little longer, but we can, especially in Germany, because our industrial base is so big and the transmission into a more sustainable economy, I think there's good reason to believe that it will be also attractive for people from outside Europe to invest into the European economy, let's say by the beginning of next year. I'm quite optimistic on this one.
So Metin, we have a number of questions from our viewers, and I'd like to begin with one of those. This new Merkel-Macron proposal is important and very positive, but the format, all caps, of proposed financing, EU borrowing, is not new, and it does not represent a true joint and several Eurobond. So in some political senses, it is Hamiltonian, but Hamilton had the US assume existing state debts, and the responsibility for paying these new EU debts ultimately falls on the member states. So how would you see that? I mean, obviously the European Union is navigating completely new territory with this proposal, even if some of the ideas in it are not new. How does one manage moving forward with the question of pre-existing debts?
Excellent question. And with an American audience, I can answer it openly and honestly. With a German audience, I shouldn't. I tell you why. This is a compromise from the very beginning. If I would say, yes, we should have this capacity, like we should have a real Hamiltonian moment. I'm a social democrat. I'm a member of the budget committee and a social democrat in the European committee. So don't ask me. For me, this is all not fast enough, not structurally consequential enough. But if we would go just a 16th of an inch too fast now, we would lose our conservative friends on this one. And as I said at the beginning, we have a grand coalition at this point in Berlin with the Social Democrats and the Conservatives. And I'm not a big fan of this. Our polling today is 15% for the Social Democrats. So I'm not really happy with the situation. But it shows that in crisis, big coalitions have more Handlungsfähigkeit, obviously. But in this particular crisis, on this decision-making on the structural changes of the European Union, I think it'd be the only combination to make any progress. So once we lose our conservative friends, there will be no majority for any step forward. So this is the technical explanation. But practically, you know what will happen. I'm pretty sure what will happen is, at this point, it's not very clear how this debt will be paid off by the European Union. It is not 100% clear. More or less two alternatives are on the table at this point. One is to pay it off with the regular budget of the European Union that is paid in by the member states. So the budget is not refinanced like a regular budget where you have taxes or anything. No, the European Union doesn't have any taxes. They just get an allowance, I would say, from the member states. And from this allowance they get every year, from this one, they can pay off the debt they're taking. This is one model. The other model is, because of this debt now, and the moment they are taking this debt, the discussion will be super exploding on this one as, shouldn't we have taxes in the European Union to pay off this debt? And what are we paying it for? So all the questions I asked from the very beginning about Staatlichkeit, give me an American English word for Staatlichkeit, Steve, please help me on this one. Because
I mean, I'd say statehood, but that's not the same as what you're talking about when you talk about.
So you see my problem when I use that word Staatlichkeit is because we are touching the core structural source of the continent at this point. And as it was in the past, big changes is always war and anarchy. So big changes should be in small steps, and this one is the one. Yes, I know it is not the Hamiltonian one. We are not moving Brussels, by the way. It will be still the capital of the European Union. So that's why it can't be a Hamiltonian moment. But I know my friends on the other side of the aisle. I've been with them. You know, I was elected into parliament, the Hamburg parliament, in 2008. That was my beginning as a politician. I've never been into office before. And I was elected in February, and the financial crisis hit Germany in March 2008. That was when our first banks more or less had this problems in their balance sheets. The United States were hit a little earlier than that. So this was early 2008. And since then, I'm following this debate from the political inside. And I can tell you the step the conservatives took in the last 2 weeks in Germany is the biggest step any conservative party has taken in Europe since World War II. It is, don't underestimate, and this is why it is a Merkel deal, because only she, not any social democratic finance minister, even if it was Olaf Scholz, could make those guys. And 12 years, we'd be fighting about this, 12 years, and there was just one bottom line: we will never, ever do this. And now they are doing it because of the coronavirus. It's the only reason. Because of the economy, that's the only reason. Because Portugal and French people should buy Mercedes also next year. That's the only reason. And that's why we're taking this super big step. But it was in their, it was in their core belief what it means to be conservative in the 21st century was 2 weeks ago was there will never be a European debt. Never, ever. So it is a big change.
So since we're talking about debt and about income streams, of course, we have another viewer question which reads as follows. The US federal government collects its revenues directly from individuals and companies, not from the states. If the EU issues bonds, it can pay principal and interest only if member states agree on a budget and make their contributions.
True.
Doesn't this make EU bonds what we in the US call, quote, moral obligation bonds?
Yeah. We will see. We will see. You know what? We don't have to guess. We will know because we will see how the markets react. There is a referee on this one. It's a capital market. So it's if it's up to Luxembourg to mess up the next EU budget, to make it impossible to pay back that debt, trust me, the bond market will react on this one. But it will not. If you look at the markets today, okay, 5 weeks ago, we weren't at this position. We didn't have this proposal. We were at the beginning of this first phase of the crisis and how the European Union reacts. That was 3 parts of this. One is the ESM would give out money, the European Investment Bank, and then that is what an unemployment reinsurance system on a European basis would act. I was actually around with other members when this decision was made, because on that night, especially in the Netherlands, it was not clear whether that was just a typical European position which you would be bought out, compromises like always Europe, or whether they are so damn serious about this that they are really willing to blow up the whole thing. That was not clear. And we were following live on this video conference how the European bond market reacted on that one. And it was scary. From a state budget scene, it is a super scary thing to be on the private market and to be dependent on this one. But it was also, I think, a tool, an element to solve the problem, because everybody, the whole public could see, guys, get your act together. Otherwise, this continent does not have an economic future. We will have to find a solution, not only politically, not only for your next national election campaign, no matter whether you're from the left or from the right in Portugal or Netherlands. we will have to find something that outside the political sphere, outside the European Union, the people who would give us money for investments in our future would have to believe us that we can deliver on this future. So it's a compromise alone is not good enough. It has to, we have to, people have to believe us what we are doing. And that made us, and this is why the European Union makes a big advantages always during crises, because in those crises, it's clear for the markets in this case, whether it works or not. So that's why I'm super optimistic. I'm not super optimistic because I think the Austrian government is so cool, and the Netherlands, they obviously have their own interest, which is fine, okay? This is a union of sovereign states. So why not having your own interest? But guess what? It's in the interest of all not to mess up the European Union as a whole. I'm optimistic at this point because of the crisis.
So I have a direct follow-up to that from one of our viewers, and the follow-up reads, will debate or dissent around funding the EU budget with new tax revenues, plus the usual debates about budget spending allocations, result in delays for the implementation of the recovery fund? Also, how influential a role will the European Parliament play compared to individual member states, given their key role in the European budget process?
Yeah, excellent question. Okay, Germany, at the beginning of July 1st, Germany takes the presidency of the European Union at this point. So for the second half of this year, we will be the country organizing, I would say, the regular processes of the Union, but in this case, obviously managing the crisis. And it was, okay, this is just, it goes, so every 6 months it changes the Ratspräsidentschaft, the Council Presidency.
Yeah, the Council President.
And it will be another, I would say, 14 years for the next turn of Germany. So what happened now, Croatia is now in the presidency at this point. And it's an old tradition, I would say, to have big fundamental problems that could not be solved by smaller states' presidencies. So what happened now in the last at least 6 months, but I would say even 2 or 3 years, is we push this whole big difficult things into the in the time of the presidency of Germany, and big Germany will solve this. Because we might pay off more stakeholders in this process. That's the idea. What happens now is we will have to find a way that Germany can solve those problems without doing it the German way, which is always a difficult thing. Always take in mind, you have to think about the smallest country, right? So I believe, I just returned from Berlin. So we were debating yesterday and today in the Bundestag. And you know what? The conservatives sit there and say, yeah, it's a good thing what Mrs. Merkel announced, that we will do this. And the social democrats alike went out and said, this is a good thing, but this is just the beginning. The next step is taxing in the European Union, harmonizing taxes and company taxing, corporate taxing in the European Union. And you know what? First row of the conservatives in the Bundestag, which is no, that's too much. So no, the debate will continue. The debate will continue. There's no consensus on this. Don't worry. It will be fight. It will be fought not only between countries, but also within the countries and the political parties. But there will be a super substantial step forward. Otherwise, it is impossible to convince the outside of Europe that we are in this together. And the moment we are not convincing the rest of the world that we are finding ourselves responsible for each other on the continent, we will lose our economic credibility. And that is something super important, especially for Germany.
There are two sort of quick questions, I think, that relate directly to this that have been posed by a couple of people. And one is, who pays back this European debt? And if nobody pays it back, it will have to be refinanced in perpetuity. Well, okay, second alternative is off the table. Some people have given an idea of that might be one of the ways. No, we don't do that. It will be paid back, and it will be paid back by the European Union. Whatever the European Union has in the future,
could be just the regular European budget as it has worked in the past. So that would be for the next 7 years. The member states agree on a budget. Then the member states would pour it into one big bucket where the European Union can take the money out for 7 years, and they can spend it on bridge building in northern Italy. They can spend it on paying back those debts. They can do anything with this within the rules of the European Union. But they could also now give the European Union the authority, the right to collect their own taxes. For example, taxes on carbon dioxide tax, or taxes on financial transaction taxes. Those are the ones that, but we are not there at this point, because that is not because of the function of how loans are being paid back. The question here is, and I'm sorry to bore you, but this is where we are at this point. It is a question of Staatlichkeit. What is a Staat?
Well, and so related to that is sort of this other question or comment, more of a comment from one of our viewers, who says most Europeans don't want a European state. And obviously it's important to move forward that the decision be unanimous. We talk about the four who are being frugal and are slowing things up, but there are others, whether domestically but also internationally, who are opposed to this plan or to this program. Obviously, we're not talking about a United States of Europe yet, but I think what makes this moment so unique is if it moves forward, it's an important step in that process of European unity.
Well, back to 1719, Hamilton. Imagine one of those guys entered this bar, or where did it take place? In a restaurant in New York City, as I understood the story. So somebody walked in and said, no, what we are proposing is, and then describing actually the United States as it is today. You know what would have happened? I would say the separate colonies would have gone crazy on this one. Never, ever giving that much authority to a central state. So this developed over the years, over the centuries, actually, in the United States. I see this actually as in Germany as well. So I'm a lawyer. So in the second semester in law, you study what is a state? That's an interesting question, by the way. So I don't want to leave this academic question of what is a state, but it's a difficult question. And when you propose most Europeans don't want one European state, well, what do they mean by not wanting it? And I'm telling you, super easy. We didn't mention this, or you mentioned it at the beginning. During the financial crisis, this European state, the Eurozone and the money of the ESM that recapitalized the balance sheets of Greek and Italian banks was a state everybody wanted. Everybody wanted. They didn't want a state that would put taxes on coffee that is sold in a supermarket or some other taxes, but they wanted a state, something that is bigger than Italy, bigger than Germany, which takes the power from the whole of the continent and channel it for the right cause into the right place at the right time. And that is a different definition of state. So I think we managed a little less well the financial crisis of 2008, 2010 than the United States, because we didn't have that Staatlichkeit as the United States. But for our prerequisites we had back then, I think we managed it pretty well. Let's take the refugee crisis. The refugee crisis, we did not manage to get a new Staatlichkeit on this one to this point. We did not manage to do so. Probably because the crisis just stopped, but when it comes, and it will come back, I would assume, there will be something more on this one as well. So at the end, if you pay taxes to finance a European border control, people might want a state. If you want a European state to to give money to recapitalize balance sheets of big companies and banks, that's a little difficult to explain, right? When the crisis happens, it's a good time. You make those progresses only during crisis, under the pressure of the crisis. Obviously, that's the history of the European Union. So forget any progress in the European Union when everything goes well. We are making our progress when things are going really bad, and at this point, our economy is really struggling.
So given the fact that you're a lawyer, I'd also like to raise the issue of the Bundesverfassungsgericht, the German Constitutional Court. In some senses, one might argue that this proposal by Berlin and Paris is sort of a response to the Verfassungsgericht, indicating that decisions about Europe's future should be made by elected governments and not by judges and central bankers. But the question that's been posed by one of our viewers is, if the Merkel-Macron deal goes through, will we face another decision by the Bundesverfassungsgericht against Europe?
Well, you will definitely face a Bundesverfassungsgerichts Urteil, always. Whether it be against it, I doubt it. For this deal, it has to be consensual between all countries. So it will be a super big debate in the German Bundestag for it. There will be a public debate about the decision-making before that in the council. We're having this debate right now. So I don't see a problem with that one. The problem is whether, the challenge, I would say, the challenge is whether this proposal fits into the treaties as we have them now. That's the technical question. But the decision to take this next step is in this case not made by the central bank, not made by the European Court. It is made by all member states, and that's a totally different deal. The crisis we had with the Anleihekaufprogramm, the bond buying problem, with the decision of the Bundesverfassungsgericht 2.5 weeks ago, is that we had this. We had a central bank that didn't have a state. A central bank, the European Central Bank, which didn't have a state because Europe is not a state, but had several states, members of this central bank. And those member states would not react and would not take action for several reasons during a crisis, but left this problem solving to the central bank. So without the central bank, we would have never come through this economic crisis after the financial crisis. So the actor that saved us economically or made it possible to grow out of this crisis was an actor, the European Central Bank, that did not have that Staatlichkeit that everybody wants. So what are you doing then? This institution does the right thing, and everybody survives on this decision making of the European Central Bank, but at the same time, but it doesn't really have the right to do so. So are we all going to die just because they are playing by the rules? So where's the development? What happened now is that the Bundesverfassungsgericht basically said, we agree that the central bank has done something good, but there has to be some, member states, please tell everybody what the rules should be for the central bank in this case, because basically the central bank has taken this right to do so on its own, and was not given it by the states, basically. So this is just the next round of more progress, I would say, because all member states know if we don't do this, the economic damage would be so big. So basically, like often in the history of European Union, we know what will come out at the end. We just don't know what the way there is. But we both know this. The Eurozone will not consist of 19 totally separated, autonomous banks, national banks, in 10 years. They will not. It will be one European Central Bank.
So, and I guess related to that, another viewer has a question. Obviously, not all of the EU member states use the euro. So does the existence of other national currencies complicate matters further?
Sorry, I have to eat something. Usually, if you look at the members of the European Union that are not member of the currency union, they would, when they entered the European Union after the euro was established, or whether they were still, they've already been in the union when the euro was established at the beginning of the century. They, besides Denmark, because they have like a special deal in this in the currency treaty, is in the future they will at some point enter the currency union. It could be short term, could be long term, but the political goal is that they also come into this. And if we didn't have the financial crisis, I bet most of them would be members of the currency union at this point. That is not a problem at all. I think it's not a problem. I think it's an indicator. It's an indicator how attractive the Eurozone is to get into in the future. And my belief is, because if you're a pessimist, or even if you're a populist, if you're a right-wing populist in Europe today, you'd say, no, there is no future to this, so let's get out of the European Union, get out of the Eurozone, and do your own national thing. That's a classical position, very classical position in the European Union, in Europe, and we know where this brought us in the past. But I ask you, Steve, what is your impression of global trends in the 21st century? I give you some words to this, some buzzwords. The development of China, world trade, climate change, migration. Do you seriously think that crazy Europeans would at a certain point in this century think that they are better off not integrating their powers together, but it's better to separate? There's no reason, there's no objective reason to cope with these challenges.
If anything, the current pandemic is a humbling reminder for a lot of nation states that there are global challenges that we face that can't be solved by one country alone, and that know no international boundaries. So obviously, you know, I give you another example. I give you another, the Brexit decision, because I was following the Brexit from a parliamentarian point of view of Germany very closely. So I don't want to go into too much detail on what the economic consequences of Brexit is for the United Kingdom and for Europe, because we don't really know for sure what will happen on the ground in detail. Let's say what probably will happen is, this is my guess as I understood, this next coming week is the fourth bargaining round of the Brexit. And I'm not an optimist at all on this procedure. And I assume, I fear that the United Kingdom will leave not only the European Union, which has already left, but will leave with no treaty afterwards. So we would have WTO rules between the European Union and the United Kingdom on January 1st next year. And that could be devastating. And I don't want to be, who knows? Let's see how this develops. I think it will be really bad. Other things, no, it's not going to be that bad if you look at people arguing about it in the United Kingdom. But I can tell you what will happen to the currency of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is not part of the European currency union. It's not a Eurozone country. It has own. And it will be a super big problem. A super big problem for, I would say, at least the lowest 20% income people in the United Kingdom, because our economies are connected. Come on, the idea is even if deglobalization makes more progress, we will be still not coming back to the days of the 60s and 50s, where you have
well, all those European countries have their industrial bases and build things themselves. So, and that would mean that those last 10 or 20% in the income scale, they be really paying more for things we've been all used to, that it's really cheap in our daily life. And that will make a big difference on national economies, but it will make a super big difference on individuals in their daily life. And I'm fearful that these people will not go for an integrated Europe as a political statement, but they will be disgusted by the system and turn out and go to the right-wing popular side and make things.
Well, so I have two follow-up questions to that. One has to do with Brexit from a viewer, and one has to do with the right-wing parties. And I'd like to perhaps close with those two questions. The first one, since you raised Brexit, is could this recovery program proposal have made it this far if the UK were still part of the European Union?
Who am I to ask? Okay, I ask you back. If the Corona crisis would have occurred in March 2016, would there have ever been a Brexit in June 2016? I would say no.
Yeah.
So we don't know. It is cool to have bad decision making on election day. People have that. Also in the United States, I remind you on this one, but as I said, China, Brazil, the development in Africa, migration, climate change, the new big power game, global power game, there's no reason for European countries not to be integrating their economic, social, cultural, and you know what, security powers as well in this next century. There's no good reason for that. You can, if you don't want to go that way, you have to constantly argue on a emotional, anti-establishment, populist, always appealing only the worst instincts of mankind for years to come. And that won't work. In the long run, it won't work.
So this last question comes from one of our viewers and ties in very closely because of what you were saying before about the far right. And the question is, how do you think the German-French agreement will impact the AfD's popularity? It seems like the popularity of Alternative für Deutschland has decreased as a result of COVID-19. But since they started as an anti-Euro and anti-EU party, do you think that this plan will increase support for them? And could it revert their platform to once again being one based on Euroscepticism?
The AfD and nationalism and populism in Europe is developing. So this is not a static political force. It is really developing. You see that that they are kicking out members of their party. They're having a lot of struggle within the party of their left, so to speak, middle and right wing. We don't really know how this develops. I would say the question is whether, I see this as an anti-establishment movement, like most populist movements. Doesn't really matter too much whether it's right wing or left wing, economically, on basis of racism and nationalism. Of course, right wing is more destructive, especially in Europe. But it depends on whether the establishment can deliver and can deal with this crisis. So at this point, the AfD dropped dramatically in the polls. So the question, Steve, is very easy. How can we deal with the economic crisis that will, if we are lucky, will last for a year? If I hope not longer than 2 or 3 years, can we deal as not populist, as responsible political and economic players? Can we show those people we are really taking your individual crisis as serious as well? And at this point, we do an excellent job on this one. But I don't know how economically, how the crisis will develop. Let's see how this goes. There could be a coming back of those guys once we are not really delivering on these issues. Remember the night before August, the night before the refugee crisis, that's so to speak, August 2015. The AfD was dead because the economic development in Germany was so good in 2015. There was no ground to win on this one, right? So there was this external factor that came in and basically triggered the internal factor of race. I would say it's all about racism, I would say. So it's really difficult to foresee. But what we can do, we as social democrats, as other democratic representatives, is we have to deliver, like always in democracies, on the well-being of the people. And for me as a social democrat, I would say we don't forget, always try to get the perspective of an individual on the crisis. Macroeconomics is super important. The global trends is important. But in a democracy, never ever lose the sight of an individual. I think the Brexit decision shows us that that didn't work in the UK. I think that some American elections showed us that it not always worked in the United States. So we should not make that mistake in this crisis now. But at this point, it's back to France and Germany. So this is the title of this. I would translate it differently. I'm not using the Macron-Merkel phrase for that one, not because I'm against Mrs. Merkel, don't misunderstand me. I said Deutsch-Französische Initiative, French-German initiative, because that goes back to the mid-50s of the big steel treaty, always trying to get something good out for the continent. If we manage to do so, there's no future for populism in Europe at all.
Well, Metin Hakverdi, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this Franco-German initiative, and indeed how important the collaboration has been between Paris and Berlin in moving the European project forward. We're at an important juncture, there's no doubt about that, and we'll have to see how this continues to develop in the coming weeks and coming months, but your insights, I think, for all of us have been incredibly insightful and useful today. So thank you very much, Metin.